Hello, class. Today we're going to continue with Case Study 3, Part 2, and we're going to focus on the question, can we feed the world with organic food alone? We're going to focus on land issues today, the demands and the problems associated with modern agriculture, specifically on the land. Now, in our last lecture, we talked about some health issues that face consumers when they eat certain types of foods. And I would say that the food that we eat doesn't only pertain to our own bodies, but it's also a matter of social and environmental justice, which is to say, who are the people that are working in these factories where our food is processed, and what are the working conditions in which these people must endure? So in continuing our case study, we're going to look at how land is available for farming on our planet and how this farming has drastically changed local ecosystems. So as you can imagine, farming is one of those human activities that can probably be very sustainable. We're talking about growing food, and we need to sustain human populations for many generations. And sure enough, for hundreds or thousands of years, many places on our planet have sustained a very sustainable type of agriculture. Places like the Nile Valley, the Middle East, rice fields in China are all areas that have been maintained agriculturally for thousands of years. And the civilizations there have been able to overcome many of the environmental problems with farming in these different places. How do they do so? Well, they examine the multiple pressures that are put on agricultural lands, and they try to mitigate for those issues. However, as global climate change is happening, we do start to see some of these systems get out of balance. For example, the picture on your screen shows a tsunami that came through the rice fields of Indonesia, and as you can see, it wiped out a lot of these different types of farm fields. So across the world, land is used for a variety of purposes, and there's actually a relatively small percentage of our land that is actually considered arable, which is to say land that can be farmed for human uses. Next to arable, another important part of land is pasture, because that's a place where we can grow different types of animals. Most of the world, however, is composed of other types of lands that aren't necessarily suitable for agricultural practices. Now, a large percentage of the world's land is actually already used for agriculture. Up to 38% of the total land area of our world, excluding Antarctica, is currently used for crops. And this really varies based on the continent. If we look at Europe, about 22% is used for agriculture, Australia 57%, and the United States is about 44%. And these numbers change. I don't test you on the percentages, but it just gives us a feel for the ways in which we use our continental lands for growing food. So if human populations are growing, that means we need more food. And if we need more land for farming, what should that land look like? Which biomes are we going to have to alter in order to create those arable farmlands? Because the fact of the matter is, land that is best suited for agriculture has already been put to use. So we have to explore other areas. Of course, this is a huge challenge because taking a biome not suited for agriculture and changing the land so that crops can grow can have a huge problem on the ecosystem health. Here we can see Saudi Arabia, a place that in the 1980s had very few farm fields, and by the mid 2012, 2013 years, we can see that there is a ton of farm fields. And of course, this is very out of place to have green, lush farm fields in the middle of the desert. But take a look at the depletion of water because of it. In the aerial view before and after, in 1987, we can see there's lots of water, and in 2012, most of the water is dried up because it's been used for that farmland. So the key to food production in the future is to make unsuitable land suitable through modifications, but only if we can do so in a sustainable way. We do not want to increase our risk for environmental damage. So here's a challenge question. So do we need to just explore the lands we already have, or do we need to find new lands? Or could we just try to use the land we already use and be more efficient? Is it possible to have sustainable farming on the land we already have? So the question I ask you is, what do you think sustainable farming aims to accomplish? Would you say that it produces the most output possible in a short period of time? Or perhaps it manipulates the land in a way that allows us to meet the food needs of the present population without compromising future humans' food supply? Or finally, would we say that it's manipulating the land in a way that allows us to meet the food needs of the present population? Well, if we apply the definition of sustainability to farming, then sure enough, the only correct answer means that we must also maintain the integrity of future human populations' food supply. Remember, sustainability is the foundation of organic farming. The producer must select and implement special practices that minimizes not only the deterioration of the soil and the land, but also of the other living things that grow in those areas. And there are a variety of techniques that producers can use, such as crop rotation, cover crops, applying non-synthetic chemicals that don't have such a bad impact on the land. There are many different ways that farmers can have a more sustainable approach. Now, as I said previously, there is land in certain parts of the world that has been farmed continuously for thousands of years with more or less no negative impact on the land because sustainable techniques have been put into place. In fact, we can turn to Egypt and other North African civilizations and look in their history and see that they cultivated food plants for 10,000 years. So what's the problem then? Why do we currently farm land in a less than sustainable manner? Is it because A, more people equals more demand equals more alteration of land, or B, is it that more technological advancements equaled more alteration of land? And when we're talking about increased technology for farm, we're talking about scientific and industrial revolution advances that continue to this day with super high-tech agriculture. Well, to get started, let's start characterizing how farm changes the ecosystem. That is to say, does the land and the organisms occupying that land, as well as the ecological interactions among living and non-living things, ultimately impact our land. We know that farming has been around for thousands of years, but even back then, even if it was sustainable back in the day, it still involved cutting down forests and transitioning the land into a way that humans could use it as an agro-ecosystem. So at home now, I want you to brainstorm different ways in which farming impacts ecosystems. I want you to consider all of the factors, including interactions in the ecosystems, the members of those ecosystems, meaning what types of organisms, as well as the abiotic factors, which means those non-living things. Another way to ask this question is to say, how does farming new land ultimately change it? So now that I've given you a chance to brainstorm, I do want to present you with some of the ideas that I had. Well, in farming, we often try to stop ecological succession and keep the agro-ecosystem in an early successional state. Most crops that are planted are on cleared lands. A second way that farming changes ecosystems is that farming is typically a monoculture. So that's a large area that's planted with a single species. And this can make crops vulnerable to attack by a single disease. Remember, genetic variety is key to maintaining biodiversity. A third way that farming changes ecosystems is that crops are often planted in neat rows. This can make life very easy for pests. The crops have no place to hide, of course. A fourth reason is farming greatly simplifies biological diversity and food chains. Reducing pests means reducing everything else, including the natural predators of those pests. A fifth way that farming changes ecosystems is plowing is required, and plowing is unlike any natural soil disturbance. Plowing exposes the soil to erosion and can damage organic matter. And finally, modern agriculture often includes genetically modified crops, and these GMOs can have an effect on the ecosystems in which the GMOs are found. Another thought question is, what is the link between genetic diversity and response to disturbance? What would you say? Would we say the more genetically diverse a population, the more resilient to disturbance or predation or disease it is? Or the opposite, the less genetically diverse a population, the more resilient to disturbance or predation or disease it is? Which one would we say? Well, first off, remember, genetic diversity is the variability of genes in a species. And if new pressures, such as environmental disasters, occur, a population with high genetic diversity has a greater chance of having at least some individuals with a genetic makeup that allows them to survive. On the other hand, if genetic diversity is very low, then none of the individuals in a population may have the characteristics needed to cope with new environmental conditions. Such a population could therefore be suddenly wiped out. Agroecosystems, based upon the way that they are set up, often promotes infertile soil. Now, in order to yield crops, we do need a high-quality agricultural soil. And these are soils that are loaded with all of the chemical elements required for plants, including both the macronutrients and the micronutrients. In a good soil, we'll have a mixture of soil particle sizes. This is the physical structure that allows air and water to move freely between the larger particles. Also, a good quality soil will retain water well. Now, based upon the practices of tilling, it can lead to erosion. And when we start to modify the land, that can ultimately lead to infertile soil. Now, for one, we might start to see chemical elements that are being added as fertilizers and pesticides building up in the soil and becoming too high of level. And if those concentrations become too high, then it can really damage the system. Now, in another instance, older soils can actually lack key elements because they leach out of the soil over time. And if elements leach too far down away from the roots, then the soil is called infertile. So therefore, we could say that leaching and erosion are what specifically decrease soil fertility. Now, leaching refers to the process by which those chemicals are moved out of the soil by water. But it's often weak acids that also can cause chemical reactions that pull minerals out of the soil. On the other hand, erosion is the physical process by which the soil particles are pulled off of the land. We've seen this before in the United States history. The Great Dust Bowl occurred in the central part of our country, places like Nebraska and Iowa, where we saw an intense farming operation. There was lots of plowing, and then there was a big drought. And as that drought dried out the land, all of this plowed soil became loose and blew away into one of the biggest dust bowls we've had in U.S. history. And where does all that eroded soil go? Well, it goes straight into our water and eventually into places like the San Francisco Bay. And that can further complicate the ecosystem and balance of these systems such as the San Francisco Bay. So if this erosion is such a problem, why do we still plow? Well, we plow because there's nothing like the plow in nature. Plowing loosens and aerates the top layer of soil, which facilitates the efficient planting of crops. Now, it is possible to solve this problem of erosion and leaching by using more sustainable approaches to the way that we plan our farm fields. For example, no-till agriculture and contour plowing might be two solutions. No-till agriculture involves not plowing the land at all. Instead, the farmers use sustainable herbicides and integrated pest management strategies to keep down the weeds, and they actually allow some weeds to grow. The goal of this is to suppress and control weeds, but not eliminate weeds at the expense of soil conservation. Contour plowing involves plowing the land perpendicular to the slopes as well as horizontally as possible. This is one of the most effective ways to reduce soil erosion, and it also ends up using less fuel and time for those tractors. How do we know about agricultural practices and farming sustainably? Well, the short answer is agricultural research. There are agricultural research organizations and academic think tanks all around the world that are constantly working on these problems of solving our global food crisis. So, based on what we've learned so far, do we think we have enough land to feed the world on only organic food? Well, in order to grow all that organic food, we would have to expand croplands dramatically, and this could destroy many ecosystems in the process. And by some accounts, even if we did this, we would only feed 4 billion people based on our current diets. But the current farming system as is must change because we are completely destroying the soil using conventional agricultural practices in many places around the world. Organic is a very important part of the sustainability solution, but so is coming up with sustainable methods of conventional agriculture. All right, so in our next part of this case study, we're going to look at food, pests, and genetically modified organisms in our quest to understand if we can feed the world with organic food alone. Now that we've looked at the land, let's look at the crops themselves and talk about how productive crops can be and what types of technologies are used in order to make these crops productive. We could say that with food, it's truly a management game. Now, one of the biggest problems we have with agriculture is pests. The food tastes good to us, but it also tastes good to things like insects that want to eat the pests. Now, actually, the most common type of pest are plants that compete with the crops. So they're not animals such as insects, but they're actually weeds that steal the nutrients from the selected crops that we're trying to grow. Pests may inhibit plant growth, and the losses can be huge. By some estimates, we think that 1/3 of the potential harvest before it comes out of the fields, and 1/10 of the harvested crop itself in the United States is destroyed by pests, because these herbivores keep eating the crops even after they get picked, and they might get destroyed in transit or in storage. So how do we control them? Well, before the Industrial Revolution, we used things such as slash and burn agriculture. We would do companion planting, in which we would plant aromatic herbs that would repel pests next to our crop species. But then agricultural science progressed, and they believe in the Industrial Revolution that they found what we call the magic bullet. However, this magic bullet was not a magic bullet. It was toxic and it really hurt people. Things like arsenic were sprayed on crops, but that led to huge birth defects and abnormalities in lots of different people. Moving forward about 50 years, in the 1930s, 1940s, we started to see petroleum-based sprays. And these petroleum-based sprays contained lots of broad-spectrum pesticides, things like DDT. And these things did a good job, but had huge problems because it would run off into the waterway and bioaccumulate and biomagnify in non-target species. More recently, and more sustainably, we've been using biocontrol. This is the next stage in the evolution of understanding how crops were tended to. And this biocontrol can be very useful. For example, by releasing ladybugs on a farm field, those ladybugs might eat the harmful insects and they don't hurt any of the crops. But as you can imagine, you need to be careful with this because sometimes the biocontrol organisms can cause problems in their own way. For example, in Australia, they released giant cane toads into some of the farm fields because they were supposed to control the sugar cane beetle larvae. However, the frogs completely took over, and there were thousands and thousands of frogs that took over farming villages, and actually it was pretty terrifying. I recommend you look it up online if you want to see pictures of all of those toads terrorizing the villages. But biocontrol can absolutely go right as well. For example, if we release things such as wasps, these wasps can lay their eggs on these plants, and then the larva of the wasp actually eats the harmful insects such as these caterpillars so that it helps control the problem. Now, even more recently, we've been adopting integrated pest management strategies, and this is a very high-tech and useful approach. It's a combination of methods in which scientists and agricultural producers use biocontrol, chemical pesticides, crop rotation, low-till agriculture, and it should be noted that this is not necessarily all organic methods. It can include organic methods, but it is very important that this is used as much as possible. The goal is to control the pest, not eliminate the pest. And because of that, it allows for a more sustainable approach to preserving habitat around the farm fields. So what is the big deal with pesticides? Well, there is a giant global market for these. Corporations like Monsanto make billions of dollars for producing these pesticides. And by some estimates around the world, we're making 2.5 billion kilograms of these pesticides that unfortunately end up in the land and ultimately in the water. So you may have some ideas for what genetically modified organisms are. And these are organisms that can be used to make genetically modified foods. Now, in many instances, these cause no problems at all. And some scientists argue that these have been used for hundreds of years. They didn't have the high technology that we use today, but scientists and farmers have been modifying genes by selectively choosing which plants can grow, where, and who can reproduce with whom. However, it has gone a little too far, because now there are a lot of GMO techniques that do have some potential for problems. And any genetically modified organism, by definition, cannot be classified as USDA organic. So genetic modification includes the insertion and deletion of genes into an organism. And on our screen here, it shows us the relationship of some terms. We have the genome, which is the entire genetic makeup of a cell, and that genome includes chromosomes. These chromosomes are made up of tightly packaged DNA, and DNA has a special region on it called the gene. And these genes hold the blueprint for one specific protein. And proteins are what give organisms traits. Proteins give organisms their structure and function. Humans have around 30,000 genes, but rice crops have around 50,000 genes. So just because you have a lot of genes doesn't mean you're the most sophisticated organism. So in food, we often use recombinant DNA, and this allows us to insert helpful genes into plant genomes, and then of course the plants become genetically modified organisms. For example, most of the United States corn carries a bacterial gene that resists insects. And this is how we're able to grow so much corn in the United States, because without this GMO process, the corn would largely get wiped out by different types of insects. So how are these genes altered in foods? Well, we use different technologies, including cisgenesis, transgenesis, and splicing in the terminator gene. We're going to look at these one by one. Now, the first type is called cisgenesis, which is intraspecies gene transfer. Now, the root word cis means same, and this is similar to cross-fertilization in crops, but it's much quicker. It produces what we might call super hybrids. Problems with this could be that the crops might be able to transfer those genes to closely related weeds. And if those genes transfer to closely related weeds, that could cause problems. We don't know. We haven't been doing this long enough to know if it could cause long-term effects. Now, by some research accounts, cisgenesis crops require less fertilizers and less water, but other scientists think they require more. So there's still a lot of research that's being done on this technology. Transgenesis is an interspecies gene transfer, and the root word inter means between. So this is where we take the gene from one species and put it into the gene of another. For example, we take a gene from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, and then we insert that gene into corn. And then the corn, if it gets eaten by an invasive insect called a European corn bearer, the insect dies. And that's good, because that's what is destroying the corn. But the bad part about this is if things like monarch butterflies have their caterpillars around, those are the non-target species, and they also die. And because of this, our global monarch butterfly populations are in steep decline. Now, BT spray is actually considered organic, but the second that we take those bacterial genes and we splice them into another organism's genome, that is when it becomes considered a GMO, and then it is considered non-organic. Another technology is the introduction of the terminator gene, and this makes the seeds from a crop sterile. Now, this is done for environmental and economic reasons. It keeps the crops from spreading, but it also forces farmers to buy seeds every single year from huge corporations like Monsanto. So this does have some socioeconomic issues. It really keeps the farmers in the hands of the agribusiness corporations, which is not good for small family farms. Now, these GM foods are very controversial. In many places, including Europe, genetically modified foods must be labeled, but in the United States, we currently have no GMO food labeling requirements. Some of the issues that people have with GM plants is that they might carry new allergens to people that we don't know about. GM plants might pass modified genes onto wild plants, and GM crops might reduce natural diversity. These are questions we just don't know the answer to. Some people agree, others don't, and many of them are scientists with credentials. Many of the crops in the United States are already genetically modified. Rice, soybeans, wheat, and corn, some of the 4 biggest crops that we have in the United States, are all transgenic crops. Are the crop yields of genetically modified organisms actually greater? Well, maybe and maybe not. They may require more water and fertilizers to increase their yield, and that comes at a cost. So the research is still out as we're trying to figure out the best solutions for feeding our growing population. We also aren't sure if they're safe yet. Because they've only been used for several decades, we just don't know what the long-term effects are going to be on both the land and the people that consume them. And as I mentioned previously, in the supermarkets of the United States, you won't know if it's genetically modified unless you choose brands that are committed to offering non-GMO choices. All right. Well, that's it for our Case Study 3 Part 2 lecture. I hope it was very informative for you to understand some of the issues about growing crops on our land, the issues facing ecosystems, and then the issues with increasing yield, particularly looking at genetically modified organisms. A lot of interesting food for thought as we explore this issue of can we feed the world on organic food alone? Please email me with any questions.